Hello and welcome to week 2. We will be discussing the framework of the Constitution and two of our main arguments that we'll be discussing throughout the class in our assigned readings this week. So, what we are going to do is use this presentation time to kind of do a quick refresher of some constitutional basics. Some of this, maybe all of it, maybe things that you have heard before in classes or elsewhere, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So what I'm going to do is use the presentation time for a quick review of the Constitution and some of the key elements of it as we move forward, and then do a brief discussion about the two readings. So the Constitution is composed of two main parts, the Articles and the Amendments. You could really break it down into three: the Articles, the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments, and all of the other amendments. So we're going to briefly go through all of these so you have a framework and an outline of how the Constitution works. Unsurprisingly, the founders put Congress as Article 1, and this is not a mistake or anything to be taken lightly. This was done very purposefully because they believed that Congress should be the central element and branch of our government. So generally speaking, Section 1 vests the legislative power of the federal government in Congress, in the House of Representatives, and in the Senate, and discusses how members are elected and what powers Congress holds. So when we talk about the powers that Congress holds, they hold the power to tax, to spend, and to mint coin. So sometimes this is called the spending power or the power of the purse. They also hold the power to declare war. I think a lot of people, probably your age and maybe even a little bit older, don't understand that Congress is the one who declares war, because Congress has not declared war recently. It's usually done by executive action. And Congress has the power to do a lot of things, to regulate postal roads, to as we've talked about, coin money and that type of thing. They also have the power over interstate commerce. And that clause says Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. And this clause used to be interpreted very narrowly. Something had to literally cross state lines for it to count. But now interstate commerce is interpreted fairly broadly. There was some reining in of it in the 1990s and later by the Supreme Court, but intra no longer means what it used to mean, and inter no longer means what it used to mean. The clause has grown in scope, and now almost everything flows through interstate commerce. And in part that's because of technology too, and the way that manufacturing works. Things quite frequently do move across state lines during their manufacturing process, and so by virtue of that alone, they are now interstate commerce. But also the interpretation of interstate commerce has grown, and it grew around the New Deal time. So interstate commerce clause is often what Congress uses to justify some of its broader actions. The necessary and proper clause also defines the power of Congress. So Article 1, Section 8, and you should take a look at Article 1, Section 8, lists out all of the things that Congress can do, and we've touched on some. And at the end, they say that Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into the execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So it's a catch-all clause, sometimes called the elastic clause, because the terms necessary and proper can be interpreted quite widely. It doesn't mean absolutely necessary, and when we talk about McCulloch versus Maryland in a few minutes, you will see that in play. But it means that Congress has broad power to act in cases where Constitution has not specifically said it should be working. So that takes us to the presidency. And again, this is a broad brushstrokes review. As we go through each branch this semester, we'll take a deeper dive. Generally, the Article 2 sets up the powers and duties of the presidency, along with the qualifications for president and the process to impeach the president and to impeach other constitutional officers as well. And the presidential powers can be described as falling into one of two categories. One is the powers within the kind of borders, so the domestic policy powers, appointments of officers, the budget powers, which are new. They're added to the constitutional duties by Congress, and the veto power. And we'll go into all of those, some of which you may be familiar with. And then the foreign policy powers, which is everything that takes place outside of the country. So dealing with treaties, being the commander-in-chief of the armed services, and being the chief of state for other countries coming to look to us. That's the chief officer they would deal with. Article 3 sets up the judiciary. What most people don't realize is that Article 3's framework for the judiciary is fairly limited. The federal judiciary is broadly set up in Article 3. It sets up the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, but does not describe the structure of the Supreme Court in terms of number of justices or anything like that, nor does it describe the structure of the federal judiciary. That actually took place in 1789 with the Judiciary Act, which started to set up for the first time what we know of now as the structure of the judiciary. And the implications of this are what is important. And the implications of this is that the Congress really does hold a lot of power over the courts. They can change what the courts are able to do and what their jurisdiction is in many cases. Now, in modern times, it would be hard to envision this happening so wholesale, but they could take away the power to hear certain types of cases. Certainly, public opinion would play a role in that, but it's theoretically possible that Congress could wholly change what the judiciary looks like and what it does. Article 4 talks about the states, and Article 4, coming where it does, gave people a little bit of a problem to start with, because many people felt that the states should have been placed ahead of those three branches, but nevertheless, the states are talked about in Article 4. And one thing I wanted to point out is this full faith and credit clause. The full faith and credit clause is Article 4, Section 1, and it says that states must respect the judgments of courts from other states. And this covers a little bit more than people tend to realize. So this covers, specific court judgments, but it also covers legal actions like family law, marriage, death certificates, marriage certificates, birth certificates, etc., are supposed to be equivalent from state to state. So Michigan can't require you to get remarried if you move to Michigan and you happen to be married in Ohio. And recently, with the same-sex marriage cases, we found this coming into play because some states allowed for same-sex marriage and some states did not. And so the treatment of those marriages over state lines became a problem. Interestingly enough, the case that opened up same-sex marriage as a fundamental right nationwide didn't really deal with this. It could have done it on a full faith and credit clause argument, but instead it kind of just went to the fact that marriage has been determined to be a fundamental right, and that it should not be abridged on the basis of sex. Nevertheless, the full faith and credit clause allows free movement from one state to another without having to relitigate issues in every state. Article 5 talks about the process of amending the Constitution, and there are two methods by which you can propose amendments. The first method is the only one that has ever been used, and that is a 2/3 vote in the House and a 2/3 vote in the Senate. So if you can get a resolution that gets a 2/3 vote in both chambers, what happens next is that you go on to the ratifying process. Method 2, which has never been used, is a convention of the states. State legislatures could convene a constitutional convention to amend or even rewrite the entire Constitution. You would need a convention of the states to do that, and then you would need a majority of states going forward, and a supermajority at that. It's never been used. It's almost thought of as an impossible way of amending the Constitution. And then the ratifying process. So you can propose an amendment, but ratifying it requires approval by the states. And you would need 3/4 of state legislatures to ratify the Constitution. And when there are 50 states, that means you need 38 state legislatures to ratify an amendment. So once the joint resolution is passed in both chambers under Method 1 with the 2/3 majority, it is sent to the state governors so they may pass it on to their state legislatures. And those state legislatures then vote on the ratification process, and you need 3/4 of the state legislatures to approve the amendment. It's not surprising that we've only had 27 amendments, given the difficulty amending the Constitution. This process is very arduous. It can take years, it can take decades, and it could even take centuries. We had one amendment take over 200 years. So this is not an easy process, and it's only when public opinion is really weighing in favor of making an amendment that it happens. Article 6 talks about the supremacy of the federal government. And the Supremacy Clause simply states that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. That when it comes to determining what law trumps state or federal law, that the Constitution of the federal government is the one that shall be supreme. So this is Article 6, Section 2, and it says, the Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or of laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So what this brings up for us is the McCulloch versus Maryland case. And in McCulloch versus Maryland, we have a situation where the Supreme Court is forced to decide whether a state can tax a federal entity. The state of Maryland attempted to tax the federal bank, the national bank, which was very unpopular at the time. And it got all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that the state could not tax the federal government, that the power to tax is the power to destroy. And because this is the process of holding money, a bank, that is extremely important. So the Supremacy Clause and McCulloch versus Maryland stand for the fact that the law of the land is the Constitution, and that everything else falls under the Constitution in terms of importance. Also, Article 6 requires that all officers of the government and of the state governments provide an oath or affirmation when they take office. I am skipping over Article 7 because it talks about the ratification of the Constitution, but we will talk about that a bit next week when we talk about ideology. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the key amendments. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and the first 10 amendments of the Constitution are usually the ones that are the most popular and well-known. Excuse me. So I encourage you to read through them. I'm not going to go through each one here. We will talk about them more as we hit on them throughout the semester. But those first 10 amendments, most of which have to do with individual rights, should be understood in the context in which they are written. And that context is James Madison wanting to control the process. Many of the Anti-Federalists felt discouraged that there was no Bill of Rights in the Constitution. So Madison agreed to put one in as long as he could write it. There were originally 12. There were 2 that were taken out, one which had to do with the apportionment of representatives, which if we had kept that formula would have given us about 5,000 representatives right now. We currently have 435 and we don't like them, so I can't imagine 5,000 would be much better. And then the other one, which eventually became our 27th Amendment, if you remember a few minutes ago I mentioned an amendment that took over 200 years to pass, said that Congress cannot raise its pay for the same session that it's in. So they can raise their pay, but it doesn't take effect until the next session of Congress. So theoretically, everybody could get voted out, and the people who voted for the pay raise are no longer there. Other than that, the amendments were ratified, and we get the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And some highlights from 11 through 27. The Civil Rights Amendments, 13 through 15, are pretty important. We'll talk about the 14th separately in a second. The 13th outlawed slavery. The 14th put into place equal protection, due process, privileges, and immunities, which again, we'll talk about in a second. And the 15th outlawed the denial of suffrage or the right to vote based on race. Those 3 taken together are called the Civil Rights Amendments, or Civil War Amendments, rather, that should say. And they came about immediately following the Civil War. The 16th Amendment is what allows for a federal income tax. The 17th Amendment allows for the direct election of senators. Many people don't understand that our senators were originally selected by state legislatures, not by popular vote. The 17th Amendment changed that. The hope was that the direct election of senators would lead to more popular control of what got done in the Senate. There's arguments that it's actually done the opposite because it costs so much to run a Senate race. But we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. The 19th allowed the right to vote for women. We had a section of time where we thought we would prohibit alcohol in the 18th and then realized that was a bad idea and repealed it in the 21st. And after the Vietnam War, we decided that people who are over the age of 18 should be able to vote. The argument being that if you are old enough to be sent to war for your country, you should be old enough to vote for your country. The 14th Amendment I wanted to separate out for a minute because there are so many complexities with it, and kind of hit on some of those main complexities. The first is the element of equal protection. Equal protection means that the government has to provide you with the same legal protections that it provides everybody else. It cannot treat you differently on the basis of some immutable quality, like race, ethnicity, national origin, etc. It's in Section 1 of Article 14, and it says, "No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law," which we'll talk about in a second, "nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." So that means the government cannot separate or segregate people out on the basis of these qualities. The Due Process Clause, which I read as part of that, it has 2 components. There's a 5th Amendment Due Process Clause, which applies to the federal government, and a 14th Amendment Due Process Clause, which applies to the states. And what it provides is that all governments must operate within the law and provide fair procedures to all. And procedures means that they cannot take your life, liberty, or property without giving you a hearing and a right to be heard and notice of what you're being accused of. And so it means that governmental intrusions into your fundamental rights and liberties have to be fair and reasonable and in furtherance of a legitimate governmental reason. And then the Privileges and Immunities Clause states that each citizen shall be entitled to the privileges and immunities of the citizens of the several states. Essentially, this allows people to be citizens in any state, regardless of where they are, based on this amendment, and that's a response to slavery. And it says it protects the fundamental rights of individual citizens and restrains state efforts to discriminate out of state citizens. So Michigan, for many purposes, cannot treat people from Ohio differently in terms of the right to certain fundamental liberties and rights. Now, you may not be able to vote in this state, but that's a voting qualification, and you're able to vote in Ohio. But they cannot deny you the right to basic freedom because you are from Ohio. So, a bit about our readings this week. And in particular, because these readings are going to be the core focus of our question this semester, which is whether or not our Constitution, our government, our institutions can stand the test of time. Um, Going into these articles a little more in depth than I might normally do is kind of important. And I don't mean piece by piece, because you can obviously read that for yourself. But I mean, we need to talk about the overall issue and why we're bringing it up. So I could teach this course a myriad of ways. We could just go through each institution, take it for what it is, and then move on. But I think the overarching question needs to be something along the lines of whether this is a good thing or not. It's okay to question it, even if you come up with an answer that is in the affirmative, right? So it's a good thing to question whether these institutions serve our best interests and whether the people in them are living up to the potential that our institutions are set up to handle. So each of these readings takes that in a different way. And in particular, the Iglesias reading, which is a little bit doom and gloom, talks about each element of his argument rests on a constitutional principle that might not carry out in extraordinary times. So the reason why I couple this with the discussion of the fundamentals of the Constitution is I want you to think about what you've learned thus far about the Constitution, about politics, and about American history, and what you were reading from Iglesias and what you are reading from the opposing viewpoint as well, and putting that into context. Is our system built to last? It's the fundamental question we're going to be asking ourselves um, uh, each week this semester and throughout the semester. We are going to be asking, is this a system that is sustainable? And is it a system we want to sustain? So, starting off with these kind of gloom and doom or, really high praise pieces is an integral part of that discussion because I want it to frame our entire semester in a way that makes sense. Have a great week, and we will talk soon.